I'll do it.
Well, I'm John Thompson. I work part-time here at the library, and I'd like to introduce to you my former boss at Waynesburg University, Ray Red. I worked at the Waynesburg University Library for 22 years. I retired a year and a half ago. Ray was my boss, so he and I, we go way back. Matter of fact, I knew Ray when he was a student at Waynesburg University. Yes?
Speak up.
Okay. I just have to give one little anecdote. Many of you know, knew my mother, Juanita Thompson, and she has a Christian bookstore in Waynesburg. When I was a high school student, Ray Red came to Bible studies that my mom and dad hosted at Thompson's Christian bookstore. So that's how far back we go. We're not going to say how many years
It
ago.
was in another century.
But Ray is known better to you and to many people as a Civil War reenactor. He's also done work as a Civil War surgeon, and occasionally he's known to put on a top hat and do a little bit of Abraham Lincoln. So anyways, we're very, very honored to have Ray here, and we're very grateful for all of you who came. And I would just say this, that if any of you want to be notified about other lectures that we're having, what we'll have is we'll just have a clipboard in this little room in here, and you can go in and sign your name, okay? Because we'd be glad to send you email announcements about this. We're trying to build up a little mailing list. So without going into any other detail, the other thing to say is if we have time, we can have some questions.
Of course.
Right? And there are refreshments set up in the table in the back room. So without
Much ado.
more, I'm going to let Ray take over. So I'll just put this clipboard on the table in here. You can sign up. Okay?
Now, I'm a fairly level-headed guy, but there's people in the back that are looking at me and probably saying, I wish he'd speak up. So if I get too loud here, I'm not yelling at anybody. Is that loud enough? Yes. All right, good. Good, okay. So yeah, my name is Ray Andrew Red. I was born in Washington County. I grew up on a dairy farm, so I have milked cows by hand and done all those farm chores. And I went to Trinity High School, graduated in 1970, came to Waynesburg in 70 and graduated in 74. I went off and got a master's in history up at Indiana University, Pennsylvania, and then I joined the Coalition for Christian Outreach and worked 3 years down in West Virginia. I got married, came back and did about a dozen different jobs until I came back here in 1997. Yes. So I had to use my calculator to find out how long I've been at Waynesburg College. That's now a university. And I realized it was 27 years that I've been there at the library as director. So tonight we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad, which is a mystery in many ways. It was hidden and it was supposed to be hidden. So I'll tell you right now, some of the things that I've found on it that you might enjoy is this book, Places on the Underground Railroad. Lots of things are going on in Pennsylvania in this book, all right? I think it even has a chapter on Washington, Greene County, all right? Now, this is the property of my library, so you have to get a library card barred, but it's there.
Excuse me, Mr. Red?
Yes.
I still can't hear you.
Still can't hear me, okay.
Is it possible to stand on the steps maybe and have Matthew do your slides for you?
Let's try that. It's
Okay.
never been done, right? It's never been done. All right, so you don't have to look down my throat anymore. All right? Yeah, okay. I brought some things to give away, all right? So we might as well do that now while you're waiting. So take one and pass them back. And I'll get up on the steps. Yeah. So Matt, we've got someone for clicking me through.
I will get that in one moment.
No, you made a path. I feel like Moses. Okay. You all got smaller.
Sorry.
Okay, I feel like Jesus. Do you have to lock the balcony sometimes? There's so many people in there? Oh,
You need a bigger place.
I don't know. We'll open up the roof like they did in the Bible and drop somebody down. Have it. Okay, so if there's one book that you want to go to Amazon and buy or get it off the shelf here, it's called Abandoned Tracks. Thomas Mainwaring, there, thank you very much. You can hold it over your head. It looks just like that. I got my own copy. The library has their copy also, so thanks for bringing that. And the author is a professor of history at WJ. He was there for quite a few decades, and he spent a lot of time in Washington County and in Greene County figuring out those things. And I think that map that's coming back probably was from his book. If I ran out, then I'll find some for you. I'll make a copy. Okay, so the tracks are abandoned. Now, when did that happen? It's a railroad of some type, but they're abandoned. They're abandoned after the Civil War. Because Lincoln emancipated the slaves in 1862 and 1863, then the Underground Railroad disappeared. And all the individuals who were part of it, sometimes they wrote books about it, and sometimes they didn't. And so not everybody is aware of who all was on the Underground Railroad and what houses were there. Now, if you're wondering about that, at any time you see a house that's very, very old, if it was built before 1860, it could have been on a railroad station for the Underground Railroad. So at that point, if you're just wondering about what's in your community, look around for the oldest house, find out who owned it in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and then look in their records and see if they were an abolitionist or if they owned a slave. Now, Greene County is a situation where Virginia, not West Virginia, but Virginia is a state that's 20 miles away. And there are slaves in Virginia and as well as Maryland. So if they are escaping, they're coming through southwestern Pennsylvania. They're coming up the Monongahela River, getting off on the eastern bank, either in Brownsville or Greene County, and they have to be escorted to Waynesburg. At that point, you look in the records and find African Americans who were in Waynesburg. More than likely, that person was on the Underground Railroad. If you find a Quaker meeting house, probably on the Underground Railroad. If you find certain pastors that are Presbyterians, not necessarily Methodists, but Presbyterians, that person probably knew somebody on the Underground Railroad. The fact was that there are people looking for runaway slaves all the time. They are going to trail them. They're answering to newspaper ads, and they are bounty hunters. And we'll talk about them, that they're going to show up very often. And they're going to know where the Underground Railroad stations are because that's where the runaway slaves will be. And oftentimes they're only a half a day away from the individuals that are running away. So the book is Abandoned Tracks, Thomas Mainwaring. The first, go ahead. We've got the county map there. The first slaves by Europeans. Before Jamestown, there were African slaves in Florida. The Spanish brought them over. How the slaves got into being slaves, that their tribes in Africa were having their own civil war, and they took prisoners and they brought them to the coast because they could sell them to the Portuguese or the Spanish and make them slaves in Mexico or Cuba or any part of the Caribbean. The Dutch came in and they weren't looking for slaves, but they were pirates. So several Dutch pirate vessels grabbed Spanish vessels because of the treasure on them and took their cargo, which some of those were slaves coming from Africa. So the pirates came up the coast, looked at North Carolina and didn't find any English people there at that time, and they came up to Jamestown. Has anybody been to Jamestown? Visited it a little bit? Yeah. Didn't drop them off there. There was an inlet about 5 miles away where they pulled up because they were pirates. And they said, we've got a lot of treasures here, a lot of things you might need. We've got swords, we've got things like that. And by the way, we've got slaves. England didn't have any laws on slavery. So what the colonists brought over were the English common law, and there was no rules about slavery. What the colonists realized was that, we've got a lot of work to do. We've got too much work to do, and we have a shortage of workers. So they're saying, oh, we've got slaves here, let's try them. There was no slaves in England that they could copy from. They just said, okay, let's try them. Also, they had individuals who were Scottish and Irish and beggars out of British prisons who were put on ships and said, you can sell your time. You're under contract, you owe some money back here, so you have to work for somebody for 6 years, and then they'll let you go. It's sort of like prison term outside the walls. And if you work 6 years for this individual, then the contract says it's over and you can go on your way. So we have slavery, and then we have indentured servants also. The idea, and these could be individuals who are ne'er-do-wells, very, very poor people who find indeed that they're, hello. How's this better? Can you guys hear me now? You can hear me now. I can hear myself. Really well. Okay, so we have the first slaves from Europe, or from Africa, and they come to Virginia as a mistake. No one planned for that. They showed up, the Dutch sold them because they were pirates, and they were purchased to go work right away, along with indentured servitude. So there's two types of workers who didn't have many rights. The individuals from England had certain rights that they could say, that's something that I had in England, I'm keeping it. Whereas the Africans had no rights at all. They didn't have language customs in terms of they, for Virginia. They had to be taught English. So, let me see. Yes. Okay. Now, so how about Pennsylvania? We'll look back at Pennsylvania, and we'll find that indeed the Quakers are settling in Pennsylvania, and they have Bible studies and a lot of them. The Quakers are interesting people. William Penn's father was a war admiral, and he became very wealthy, serving the King of England. And at one time, the King of England was living in France, and William Penn's father, with his own ships and his own cannons, picked up Charles and brought him back to England and said, okay. And he says, I can't pay you for the strip, but I'll get to it in a couple of years. He said, fine, okay, but you owe me, right? Yeah. And so the king never paid William Penn Sr. back. And he died, and William Penn Sr. died. Now, William Penn Jr., he was under the influence of some Reformed Scottish Presbyterians at that point, and his dad said, I don't like the church you're worshiping. I think you need to go to Paris and go to school in Paris, young man. So William Penn Jr. gets on the boat, goes to Paris, and he loves life a lot. And he learns how to use a sword, and he's having a really good time. Then his father dies, and William Penn knows that the King of England owes his dad big time. And so he comes back to Charles, and he says, yes, I'm the son, the only son, and we need to talk about what you didn't pay my dad. And Charles says, well, yeah, it was quite a big sum. What would you like? And William Penn said, okay, I've saw my old friends who were Quakers, and I'm going back with them. Even after being in Paris and learning how to play the swords. And William Penn said, I brought a map. And he put the map out and said, I'm not talking about cash here. I want this. And it wasn't New York. It wasn't Massachusetts. It wasn't Virginia. It wasn't that Chesapeake Bay in there. He said, I want that. You give me that. Draw 2 lines on the map, says it's mine. I'm good. And the king said, that's good. We'll do that. And so he inherited from the British Empire all of Pennsylvania without a map, right? The Allegheny Mountains, who knew where they were at the time. So he used his Quaker faith to accommodate other Quakers are saying it's pretty rough being in England with the Presbyterians and the Catholics. Let's go to another place. And so he brought everyone over to what would become Philadelphia. And he says, here's the rules: non-violence. Has anyone been to Quaker meeting? No? Yes? What do you remember about a Quaker meeting?
I remember the silence, and the waiting and sort of anticipating
Yes.
what would be said. And I was amazed that not everything that was said was spiritual.
Okay.
I've been to the meeting where they read from a newspaper an interesting article. But it always amazed me, the quiet, and then suddenly somebody is moved.
Right. So there's no pulpits in a Quaker meeting. There's no hymnals in a Quaker meeting. If you feel like singing, stand up and sing. If people know the song, they'll sing with you. If you've had a moment of silence, you will indeed make a short speech, and someone will say, yes, I was thinking about the same thoughts and things like that. So it's very, very democratic, all right? Nobody's behind the pulpit, there's no choir up there. And so about 3 or 4 guys in Philadelphia are having their Bible study, right? And yes, that document go back one, there it is. That document is the original document about 4 guys. And they're studying the Bible. And they're looking at the book of Exodus. And they're saying, I don't think God likes slavery. You know, he got his people out of slavery right away. And he punished the slaveholders too. And they would go, yeah, let's look at slaves in the Bible. They had a Bible study on slavery. And in this instance, the individuals were enslaved and they weren't, and kings had slaves. And slavery was common throughout the Middle East and in Europe. Native Americans captured white settlers and made slaves of them too. Right? So slavery at that time was just something bad that happened to you. And hopefully you can work it out and get out of that situation. France didn't have any laws on slavery either at the time, right? So it was one of those things that you're captured in war. They expect if you survive, you're going to be a slave for a while. So William Penn and this Bible study start to think about interpreting slavery, that people want to come to Philadelphia now with their slaves, and that's what that should be. So that document is the first document in American history and in North America. 4 guys saying, you know, I think God's got a problem with slavery. And what do they do in the meeting? They read it out loud. Well, okay, so their Bible study gets read out loud, and people start saying, well, why is that? And they start discussing why slavery should not exist because God doesn't like slavery. And they talk about the New Testament about what is freedom. You know, Paul said he has certain freedom over here. So that document is the first document which is saying we should not have slaves. We should seek to abolish slavery in our little colony, right? And that's the very first abolitionist movement in colonial Philadelphia, and William Penn Jr. buys into it. He says, right. And so his colony, there's colonies that have slaves in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. There's slaves in New York City, slaves in Virginia and Maryland. He says no slaves here. Right? So he's an abolitionist owner of the Pennsylvania colony. Every one of these individuals decided by the 1830s who were Quakers, and Quaker women and Quaker men have pretty much the same ability and sources and can get up and speak at any time they want or tell a song. So Quaker women become abolitionists, and they are indeed very outspoken about slavery. And so we have in Philadelphia, the first anti-slavery movement in which men and women, if you look at that photograph there, I believe there's 12 men and 10 women side by side, all being abolitionists. So it's not just a guy thing. It's not like a weak female type thing. Well, there shouldn't be any slaves. No, all these people sit together, talk about it, and then they found newspapers. So Pennsylvania has a heritage of abolition. There were slaves in Pennsylvania. There were slaves in Greene County till about the 1840s, I believe. And because there were slaves that were emancipated in Pennsylvania, they stayed here. Those families are going to be Underground Railroad conductors. So if you're looking at different counties, genealogies, and histories, if there is a community of African Americans anywhere in that county, that's a part of the Underground Railroad. Also, if there's any Quaker meetings, they're also part of the Underground Railroad. And being good neighbors, sometimes other people know that that guy's on the Underground Railroad, but I'm not gonna make my neighbor unhappy by saying they're over there, all right? So the Underground Railroad is sometimes very dedicated because we have certain ideas, and sometimes the Underground Railroad is like, well, I know that guy's got African American slaves hidden over there, but I'm not gonna mess things up with him because that's what he does. So neighbors sometimes know, and they don't say anything to the slave hunters that come in. Now, the United States Congress passed the rule that you could have detectives finding slaves. And if they found a slave in your neighborhood, they were allowed to capture it. They would go take him to court, says, this is the slave I've been chasing, I'm taking him back to his masters in Virginia, and that was perfectly legal. So the idea that if you have escaped slaves, somebody is probably looking for them, a hired detective who's on the trail. And so you really don't talk about it. You don't make your neighbors aware that you are hiding individuals, because somebody's gonna talk. Someone's gonna go to the bar and say, well, I was looking for them over here, you know? So we've talked about the Quakers and about individuals who, because out of religious compassion, dislike slavery and work on the Underground Railroad, and then decide to take their petition to Congress and say, and they took it to Pennsylvania first, and Pennsylvania outlawed slavery. I think it was in the 1840s. And the United States government did not outlaw slavery until the middle of the Civil War. Right? Now, does anyone have any questions or suggestions at this point? No? You got it. Oh, the mic on fire. That was a contribution by Chuck Fider, who's a retired professor at Waynesburg, who taught me a whole lot about John Dos Passos and Sinclair Lewis
I wanted to
and
tell you
Hemingway.
something.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of Hannah Lightfoot?
Lightfoot?
Yeah. She was a
Possibly.
Quaker that lived in Jefferson.
I heard Jefferson had some Quakers being
Yeah.
houses.
She was my great-great-grandmother. Oh, wow.
So can you find your genealogy?
I've been trying to trace it. She had, what they claim is that she had been married to King George,
Okay,
and he had sent her to, back to the United States, or to the United States, and he set her up in that farm, Mr. Bean owns.
okay,
He recently just passed away, I believe, but, it's past, the graveyard out there. It's like kind of a little gingerbread looking house,
okay,
but, she had several children, and they ended up being named Rex, which means son of the king.
yeah,
And that's what my grandmother's had come, straight down from that genealogy, and she was heritage, and she was named Lucille Rex.
okay.
But I traced, I just need help doing it.
Where's Dave Cressy? Dave Cressy, he's not here, he left. There's a place in Waynesburg, the Genealogical Society, which is in a log cabin right behind the
I
courthouse.
mean, it's so interesting to me, I'd like to even have like a DNA or something if possible
Sure,
to find out. I mean, I have my DNA taken already, but just to see,
and if there are Quakers out there, find out who else is a Quaker.
I don't know.
But
I just know that she was a Quaker and
okay,
lived in the house, and the reason he had divorced her, or whatever you call it, in that time is because they wanted him to marry, she was a commoner, and they wanted him to marry royalty.
somebody who,
So he sent his kids and her and set them up and they give them a step at which would be considered child support, you know.
And he called his kids Rex. You're a
Rex.
king here.
Yeah,
Not anybody's else.
they had no last name, they had no surname, so it
Really?
was, yeah, they gave.
Well, that's
their name
difficult.
was Rex.
Matt, could you turn the slide?
Yes, of course.
All right.
Sorry about that.
No, we're good. This is a National Geographic map, and if you find a map of the Underground Railroad in any publication, you'll notice that it's along the coast, the Atlantic coast. It comes out of Virginia, goes through Ohio, which is accurate, goes up to the lake. A lot of individuals, runaways go to Canada, where there's no slavery. So if they're up near Niagara Falls, they're more than likely jumping over into Canada and saying, I'm free now. This has been the 1840s, 1850s. So the Underground Railroad ends in Canada. And there are individuals who go to Pittsburgh and Washington, Pennsylvania, they live in the black community and change their last name. They probably invent their last name. Pittsburgh has a lot of Underground Railroad stations in it, and some of the individuals are proudly Underground Railroad. There's a newspaper editor who's a black man who had the first black newspaper in Pittsburgh and in the United States, and he was a devout anti-slavery editor. And he knew everyone in Pittsburgh who was an abolitionist, and so there was abolitionists on the north side, the south side, downtown Pittsburgh. Where Duquesne is now, that was the poor side of town. So Irish immigrants moved in by the Monongahela River, and when the African Americans settled, they also had poverty housing, and they lived with the Irish in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so these two very poor nationalities got along fine from this part, right? And they all worked at poverty level jobs. On the right-hand side, the Underground Railroad gets its name from a newspaper article that abolitionists talked about the Underground Railroad. They had to name it something. This is William Still. William Still's in Philadelphia. He's yes, you have a question? No, we're okay. That is his autobiography to the right. That's his picture. And he's a very young individual. And they say, you want to be help with this? He says, yes. Okay, so you're going to take down names. Anybody who walks in here and identifies themselves as a runaway slave, get their name, we'll give them housing, and then we'll move them along the Delaware River. And so he's new to his job. And he's working, and someone comes up and he says, my name's Evan, and I'm doing this. And he says, Evan, how do you spell that? And they start talking, and he's like, okay, where did you come from? Well, I came all the way from Alabama. Really? How'd you get here? Okay, got that. And then as William Still's working, he looks up, and he sees his brother. Oh. And he says, are your parents? Yeah. And his own family were escaped slaves. And so that starts to happen in many places where your cousin's in front of you and he ran away, she ran away. So the individuals who are on the Underground Railroad, a lot of these are runaway slaves who now have the protection of being in Philadelphia, and they've got their paperwork in line, and they've gone to court and they've declared they're not enslaved anymore in Pennsylvania. So that's just an amazing story, and it shows you where the Underground Railroad is. It could be anywhere. It could be in the next person who walks through the door. It could be someone that sits beside you in church, and he's that person is like, doesn't say much. It could be Julius Lemoyne in Washington, Pennsylvania, who everybody knows is an abolitionist. So let's move on. Let's try the next slide. There's William Still. That's the individual. He has a biography, and it's the story of the Underground Railroad. So if you want a good book about one of the conductors on this Underground Railroad who was a runaway slave, and he was in Philadelphia, most of the time William Still is in most history books for high school students. That's a story that's been captured. And when they talk about the abolitionists, they'll talk about the Quakers, and those white individuals and African Americans who have been freed are working on the Underground Railroad. So it's not too far to say that the Underground Railroad was integrated. Now, from my understanding, in Waynesburg, there's several slaves that are runaways that are settled down. One is a barber, and I think it's talked about in Man Marion's book, and he's a barber, and he is on the Underground Railroad. And he lives downtown, and I think he's by himself. I don't think he has a family. Now, for the Underground Railroad, we know that if you found the right conductor with a boat, you would be coming up the Monongahela River. And at that point, you would get off one side, the east side, and go to Brownsville. And on the west side, you would get off and come to Waynesburg and be there. Now, Route 19 was not there, but there was a road between Waynesburg and Washington that's now Route 19. And oftentimes, many people, whether it's Amity or Prosperity or Waynesburg, there are individuals who will do commerce, and under the commerce in their wagon is a slave, and they're moving to the next community. So if you're in Waynesburg as a runaway slave, they might take you north to Amity, and then then another farmer will take you into Julius Lemoyne's place. And Julius Lemoyne is being investigated by the slave catchers, and he'll move you on to another farm around Washington, Pennsylvania. Now, hold up that piece of paper that you have in your hand. Turn it around. Yes, that's the map. If you haven't got one of those, I'll get you one of those. That is the Underground Railroad that we know about from the books, that indeed they came to Waynesburg, they made a left going to West Greene County, went up that way, and then either went to Washington, Pennsylvania, or went directly into Pittsburgh. The fewer stops you have on the Underground Railroad, the more likely you're not going to get caught, because they're not going to be able to talk to you. They're also on the Monongahela River. They go to Brownsville and they go to Pittsburgh by getting on the Monongahela River and then getting dropped off in Pittsburgh if they want to. And eventually, if you're in Pittsburgh, they're going to run you to Canada if you want to go. Otherwise, you can live with the Irish on the south side of Pittsburgh. So one more. There's a map of Greene County, and there's a map of Fayette County. So on the Monongahela River, which is between the two counties, if they let you off on the right side, you're in Fayette County, and you're going to go to Pittsburgh, more than likely, another way. If they let you off in Greene County, more than likely, you'll go to Waynesburg, and it'll fork. It'll fork into Washington County. Sometimes they'll keep you on the Monongahela River and take you up as far as it'll go, probably to Pittsburgh. So the river is part of the Underground Railroad, different paths and different farms. Now, in the books that I brought, there's a McKeever family in Washington, and they were loud about their abolitionists. And they often say that the house that's still there was an Underground Railroad. So the slaves, freemen that were there, often only went 8 to 12 miles away at one time. So it was not fast at any means, it was slow. Another neighbor, we go up, we visit the neighbor, we, open the back of the wagon, usually done at twilight or at night. And you, as this free man, you would get out and they would take you somewhere. Either in the house or in the spring house or some place in the woods where they would keep you overnight, knowing that indeed you could be discovered at some point at any time. So go ahead and one more page. Now, here's an online source that you can use. It's called explorepennsylvania.com. And this is from the Harrisburg. This is the Pennsylvania Department of History. And they have, if you want to start with the Native Americans, the whole website starts with the Native Americans and who is here. And then they take you through William Penn, and they take you into the Underground Railroad. And then they have chapters. So if you want to know about Pennsylvania baseball, they've got a whole chapter with links to Pennsylvania baseball. If you want to know about the Nora, which had a fog inversion and people died there, they'll have a whole chapter on Pennsylvania's environmental movement. So if you want more history, you go to Explore Pennsylvania and click on the stories that they're going to tell you. It's organized in such a way, I use it with students when I teach Pennsylvania history. It's about 15 to 20 minute chapters, lots of maps, lots of photographs in there. And so this semester I'm teaching United States environmental history, and I use that for Pennsylvania's history. And I include it on tests and, yeah, go to the website. So I would encourage you, and they have a chapter on the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, where the William Still story is there, all the conductors in the southern counties. And here's a typical one, all right, looking for a typical story. There's an individual who walks with a limp. These guys, he's deformed a little bit, and he's a lawyer. He lives on Main Street in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and his name is Thaddeus Stevens. And he is going to run for Congress, and he's going to become a congressman. But he has money, and his money comes from earning trees, and he makes charcoal, and then he finds the iron, and he has these iron furnaces in Adams County. They are remote. Pine Grove Furnace State Park is one of them. He's got one in called the Mariah Furnace, and it is west and south of Gettysburg. So when the Confederates invade Pennsylvania, they have their list of people who are Underground Railroad conductors. And Thaddeus Stevens employs, with wages, slaves that have run away. And so if you're Underground Railroad, it's like if you get to Gettysburg, you got a job from this guy. And indeed, so he's on the list. And there's another individual named Schmucker, Dr. Schmucker, who's the president of the Gettysburg Theological Seminary, and he's on the list too. And so when the Confederates show up, they just go through his house and tear everything up. They don't burn it down, and they are looking for the guy who owns the iron furnaces. And they actually burned down one of his furnaces coming into Gettysburg. They said, he's on the list, let's get rid of him and make it tough for him. They can't find the Pine Grove Furnace because it's way north, way north, 20 minutes drive, it's deep in the woods. There's a community there at Pine Grove Furnace called Yellow Hill. Yellow Hill is a mixed race community. Blacks and whites, and they're all iron workers are there. And the Confederates can't find that place, and it's north of the battlefield by about 25 minutes. So if you want to know more about Pennsylvania's Underground Railroad, go to Explore Pennsylvania. There's a lot of links and stories, and it even gives you a bibliography of new research done on the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. One more. So this, our knowledge about the Underground Railroad is new. It's less than 100 years old. There's a book called The Liberty Line that came out in the 1960s, and people said, I've never heard about this. And it's a historian who went through all the journals and the newspapers about how there was an Underground Railroad, and it was real. There's one woman I have to talk about at this point. She's a mom. She lives in Ohio, and she has, I think, 4 or 5 kids, and her husband's a pastor, and he's a teacher in a college, and she's exhausted at night. She really is exhausted. And her name's Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she goes to Kentucky, because she lives in southern Ohio, and she goes across the river, and she's amazed when she goes to, and they say, you want to go to a slave auction? Let's go. If you haven't been there, we'll go look. And she's amazed. She reads the newspapers, and she studies them and takes them home about the slave advertisements and these individuals that are hunting for slaves. And at night, the kids are in bed, husband's writing a sermon, and she decides, I can't get to sleep. I'm going to start writing a story. I'll tell the kids, and they'll get to bed now. She writes it, she writes it, she writes it. Goes back to Kentucky, does her research in Kentucky, and she comes back and she said, send it to the publisher, and it's like, I'm not an author. I enjoy writing at night when my kids are asleep. My husband's working in his office. So do with it what you will. They start reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they're saying, let's publish this. All right? Hi, Kate. They published it, and people were moved. It's very melodramatic, and the way she put it together, there was a married couple in Kentucky. The master got some gambling debt. He's got to split up the families. And so she's gonna sell her husband, and she might keep the kids. No, yeah, so they're small kids. And so she decides she's gonna run away. And she finds some safe houses, and she's getting across, and they're hot on the trail, and the dogs are out, and she hears the dogs, and it's snowing and icy, and she gets to the Ohio River, and she's thinking, maybe I should just give up. I got my kids with me, I don't want to get them hurt. I can't, this is icebergs floating in the river. And then the dogs come up, and she takes the kids and jump into the river. She gets on an ice island and floating, and the dogs crash in the water, and they chase her. And then finally, she says, I think I'm in the right spot. I'm gonna try to get over to the other shore. And then the slave hunters come up behind her and say, well, don't waste any bullets on her. She got away. And she says, there's supposed to be a light along the river here. One of these houses, I'm supposed to go there. And so she gets out, and she climbs the hill with the kids, and she gets to a house where a woman opens up, and she said, did you run away? She said, I did with my kids. They were going to sell my husband, and I left in Kentucky. And she said, okay, get in here, let's try and have something to eat. Here comes my husband. You go to the basement. You go to the basement. And he comes through the door. How are you, honey? I'm back from Washington, D.C. I'm a representative down there. All they want to argue is about slavery all the time. They want to emancipate slaves. They want to make laws for slaves. He said, just let the South keep their slaves. And his wife says, do you really feel that way? Yeah, just keep on the other side of the river. Well, if you met one, would you do that? He says, yeah, I'd call the sheriff and get him out of here. And she said, okay, just hold on. And she goes to the basement door. Come on up. I want you to meet my husband. He sees them, mom and the kids. And then the wife says, what are you going to do? And he shuts up. In the book, he shuts up. And at that point, it comes out later, it's like, that was the night I became an abolitionist. That's the night I became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He said, do you know how to send them north? And she said, I have friends. And so she puts them north, and eventually her and her husband meet up, and they go to Canada and live happily ever after. This book is a bestseller, and it's burned in the South. If you get off the train carrying that copy, you get canceled. All right? You just get canceled on the spot. And the South is starting to complain about this book. I can't believe any of you Northerners would read it or understand this book, but that's one of the instances where a white individual who writes stories at night goes to Kentucky and lets her heart absorb what's going into Kentucky. That story, people found a commonality with her. Once you go over the rivers and engage with a slave market and see slaves being up and families broken up, it'll make you an abolitionist. And so that's what Stowe was talking about. And that book created more abolitionists than anything else in the 1840s, 50s, and later in the 60s. So the South is invading the North. If they know you're on the Underground Railroad, they're going to destroy your property, like they did with the pastor's house in Gettysburg, the congressman's iron plants in Adams County. At that point, and this is sort of the Underground Railroad, we're going to finish up with these type of stories, that when the Confederates invade Pennsylvania in 1863, they take all the horses, they take all the wagons, they take the runaway slaves. This is the time when the slaves, if they're alert, like, goodbye, I'm going to Harrisburg. I'm going to cross the longest bridge in the United States at the time. I'm going to Harrisburg. I'm going to go to Yellow Hill. Thaddeus Stevens will put me up there. And they are looking for runaway slaves. And the president of the Gettysburg Seminary, his house is invaded. His books are all torn up. And they're looking for maps of the Underground Railroad. And so the idea that the Liberty Line, which is a new idea in the 1960s, one historian decided there was an Underground Railroad, and we have found some diaries, and we read the newspapers, and we want you to read William Still's book and say that, yes, Philadelphia was a hub, and Pittsburgh was a big hub for runaway slaves. And if they felt uncomfortable in Pittsburgh, they put them on the Allegheny River and take you up north towards Canada. Okay, and that's the book, Liberty Line from the 1950s. So the actual phrase Underground Railroad was first appeared in the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison. What a troublemaker he was. Even in Boston, they couldn't accept him. He said, the Constitution is an agreement with hell because it allowed slavery to exist in some states. And so he was almost lynched several times. He was beaten up several times because he was an abolitionist when there were very few abolitionists. So in his newspaper, The Liberator, which if you were caught with a copy, then you must be an abolitionist. And you're probably on the Underground Railroad. That cat was exciting, wasn't it? I should give him the mic. So yeah, the Furries Underground Railroad came from an abolitionist newspaper. It wasn't coined by the slaveholders or anyplace else. It was in a newspaper, and people said, yeah, that's probably it. Railroad to get the slaves out of the South, but it's all underground. It's hidden. We don't know where it is, but it sort of shows up when you need it. The phrase did not become common until the mid-1840s. So if you're looking for the Underground Railroad, no one's going to identify that in their family until the mid-1840s. So there's nothing in colonies about it or early national period. There was another name that was used in common parlance called the Liberty Line. So before the Underground Railroad was made famous as a term, it was called the Liberty Line. So you knew that your house was a station on the Liberty Line. But as people started realizing that it's going pretty well, there's a railroad, it's underground, and they're getting slaves out of the South. 1842, railroads are very new and they're going everywhere. And the question is for the Underground Railroad, how much evidence is there for it? Was it effective? And the idea that where does it exist? Could it be in one place and disappear when someone moves? Is it always permanent and stationary? Maybe someone says, I'm going to move my station on the Underground Railroad. I'm going to find some new individuals like Lemoyne did. And when slaves came up to his house, the slave hunters knew that it was a station on the Underground Railroad. So he moved them around Washington, and North Washington and western Washington, out to the point where Greene County was closer. There were individuals who were on underground western Greene County and western Washington County because the slave hunters would always go to Washington, Pennsylvania, and have the Lemoyne house searched. So free blacks, Quakers, Cumberland Presbyterian churches were all people that were probably for the most part studying about abolitionists being on the Underground Railroad, like Waynesburg College, when it was founded in the 1850s. That there's no direct line that we know of, but there was enough written by the first students and first president of the college that we'd welcome any slave to run this way. And there was a black barber that had a location that people could reach out to, and he had friends that he could move to either west or due north. So if you got to Washington, Pennsylvania, you might go to Cannonsburg, and from Cannonsburg, you might go to Pittsburgh. So it was a night's drive by horse, the distance between Underground Railroad stations. So some neighbors would have neighbors that are 10 or 15 miles away, but everybody else in between was not on the Underground Railroad, but that neighbor was. And so it was a very secret type of thing. Go ahead. So these are books that if you go to Amazon, they're still there. The Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, that's a really good book. The Underground Railroad, another copy in South Central Pennsylvania. There's more been written about South Central Pennsylvania as underground, but you can see the patterns and how far apart the stations are in South Central, where Gettysburg is, Adams County. And say, okay, let's look at the distance between stations over here, and when there's 3 stations in and around Waynesburg, where might the next station be? All right, and you have to go back to who owns what property in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. Okay, you're gonna be on TV. He knows that. Okay, so one more turn, the Liberty Line, there's the Lemoyne House, and to the right of that is the crematory, which they have tours of the crematory. So Lemoyne was a doctor who was on the Underground Railroad, and he said, coffins I don't think are very healthy for anybody, even if you're buried there. And so he suggested that cremations are better. And so you can find the first crematory about 2 miles from his house, and it's on South Main Street. So he was one of those individuals who thought outside the box and didn't mind having opinions, which people were like, is that a little bit nuts? But then the crematory was used. And his idea was like, if you put people in the ground in wooden caskets, and if the casket deteriorates, then everything's gonna go in the groundwater. And the groundwater is gonna keep it, and then it's gonna go down into your creek. So at some point, if that casket probably leaks after time and deteriorates after time, you're better off cremating your ancestors and don't bury them on the hill. Where I live in a place today that there's a family cemetery out on my back door. They've owned the place since the American Revolution almost. And there's row of trees, and that's where the Snyder family buried everybody. And it's on a sort of a low hillside, but there's no water around it. So, and my family has their own. I've been to one for my family, the Red family. There's a place called Red's Mill. And I went and seen the 1780s, 1790s graveyard. And they're all on slopes. And you just wonder if the coffins haven't moved down the hill, but the stones are there. Go ahead. So if you're looking for a Quaker meeting house, this is what they look like. All right. That's in central Pennsylvania, 2 doors, and usually 2 windows, 2 doors on the back side. It's probably maybe 20 by 20. And that's it. It is like Quakers, plain. They might have benches with no backs, because you're not gonna go to sleep. And, if you got to lean into something, you might go to sleep. They're gonna keep you on a bench all the time, and usually put you in a circle. So, hey, that guy's falling asleep over there. So the Quakers were, no pulpit, no choir, but they looked at each other in the eye, and they were finding out who was nodding off, and so that's it. So if you're looking around, if you can find in your community a house that looks like that, that's pretty ordinary, that might have been a Quaker meeting house. You have to go back on the maps and see if it was a Quaker meeting in the county. One more. Southwest Pennsylvania had slaves. Westmoreland County had slaves. Greene County had slaves. Fayette County had slaves. Washington County had slaves. It's not going to be until about the 1820s or 1830s where Pennsylvania and the United States owned slaves. So in the earliest parts of our county, in our southwestern Pennsylvania, there were African Americans who were slaves. Augusta County, Virginia, that's Washington, Pennsylvania, right? If you go up by Route 40, they've got these highway wayside markers, and up by the, not the Franklin Mall anymore, it's another mall. Washington Crown Center, with the leaky roof. It's got a marker there. This was once Augusta County, Virginia. So how close was Virginia and slavery to Greene County? It was right there. It was in our backyard, right? Augusta County, 1781. There's 12 townships in Washington County. There's 0 to 25 slaves in them. 2 of the counties have 26 to 50 slaves. 2 have 51 to 75 slaves. So there is slaves here. Pennsylvania is going to emancipate the slaves in about the 1840s. And no one asked them to leave because they're already here doing work. They're craftsmen. So you take that number and you've got a lot of stations on the Underground Railroad. So if you can go to the census of 1840, and usually the census of 1840 will have a note, this is a black person, and this is where they live, then you'd say, well, okay, he's probably on the Underground Railroad. And in black church, so we have black churches at this time, the 1840s, which I think we have 1 in Greene County and 1 or 2 in Washington County. That's the Underground Railroad also. So the routes that we have on the map from these Virginia counties, Hancock, Brooke, Ohio County, Marshall, Wetzel, Monongahela, Preston, Allegheny County, Virginia. There is a group called the Clarksville Nine, and they entered Pennsylvania at Blacksville, and they are on the run, and they're going to be captured. The slave hunters are going to find them in Pennsylvania by the 1840s. Blacksville to Waynesburg to Carmichael's was the plan. So they come to Waynesburg, and then they head towards the river, get on a boat that somebody could have for them, and go up to Pittsburgh. Carmichael's to Rogersville, to West Alexander, to West Middletown, to Washington, to Pittsburgh, and on to Perrysville. The Underground Railroad we know is Butler County, Mercer County, Meadville, Erie County. That goes to Cleveland. It goes to Detroit. It goes to Chicago. Now, John Brown, he's a Pennsylvanian. He was born and raised in Pennsylvania. He was north of Pittsburgh near Meadville. His family lived there, and he read the Bible. He wasn't a Quaker, but he said, God doesn't want slaves. He doesn't want you to be a master over another man. And as he studies his Bible at home and has kid after kid after kid after kid, he feels very devout. He's trying to get a co-op going of sheep farmers. You know, there's people from England and France in Greene County and Washington County that are saying, we'll buy all the wool on your sheep that you shear for next fall, and we're buying futures of wool. And so there's futures of wool selling in Western Pennsylvania all the time. You go up to Meadowcroft Village, and they'll tell you the story that, and you know, the Downey House, when they looked at its register, it's like, who's from France? In Greene County, who's from England? These were all wool buyers that were buying the wool off a sheep's back. You were going to share it, you're going to put it on a wagon, you're going to put this address on it and send it to Britain. Cotton was a favorite in the South, and the South thought that England's going to enter the war to get the cotton. On the other hand, England was buying a lot of wool off the United States. John Brown's north of Pittsburgh. Eventually he goes to Kansas, and eventually is hung for treason against the state of Virginia at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Comes West Virginia, 1863. So there is a tradition in Western Pennsylvania of being anti-slavery. It's not, and there's these books that we have that have traced it down. I think in my handout, or I can send you a handout, I have them listed. Finally, one more slide, the Liberty Line in Greene County, I think we've talked about that. And Washington County, you've got a map about that. One more, there's Julius Lemoyne. He was on the Underground Railroad in 49 East Main Street. He knows of 12 sites that are recognized in Washington County that he used when slaves then got up to him. He sent them someplace else almost overnight. Did he hide his slaves on the property where he lived? He says he did. But if that's the first stop among the people that are looking for slaves, he's going to move them in a heartbeat. If they show up at 9 o'clock at night, Julius Lemoyne is going to make sure by dawn they're someplace else. So if he gets any knocks on the door from the slave hunter, it's like, well, I know they passed through, but I don't know where they went. And that's the Underground Railroad. It's like, well, we saw them at your house. Yeah, they were here, and then some guy picked them up and took them out. I didn't know they gone. So that's the information that everybody gives. If they're like, well, we know you're on the Underground Railroad. Well, they were here in front of my house, but then some other guy came up and picked them up and they left. I don't want any trouble. All right. So I think one more. Yep, there's in Washington County, we know, as Lemoyne tells us, Thomas and Matthew McKeever, James Sr. and James McElroy. That's in Manwaring's book. William Asbury, Samuel McCullough. All these individuals are west of Washington. You know, western Greene County is due north of where the Liberty Line was in western Washington County. So we know West Alexander had John and Samuel Atkinson, Thomas Gilmore in Ohio County, Virginia, Mays Bells, Kenneth McCoy in West Findlay, Samuel McKinnon, and the three Presbyterian Church were all stops on the Underground Railroad. So private property, farmers who had barns to hide people in, church basements, that's the Underground Railroad also. One more. So there's also information at the Washington County Historical Society.
when people would leave Washington, generally speaking, they'd go to Cannonsburg overnight, stay in Cannonsburg, and then go farther up where Route 19 is. So Route 19 out of Washington, out of Waynesburg to Washington, that was a passageway. Route 19 out of Washington to Cannonsburg, that was a passageway. And Cannonsburg up to Carnegie, that was a passageway. One night's drive or one afternoon's drive with a wagon that you have covered up. And I think we have one more. Yeah, Washington County to Pittsburgh, Route 50 to Carnegie. Green Tree had underground railroads, and Route 31, Castle Shannon, they have a house that says it was on the underground railroad. And, you know, some people can say it, but other people can prove it. Right? So it's just to say that, well, I'm pretty sure that somebody lived here was on the underground railroad. Like, was there any details that you know? Who lived here in the 1840s? Is your house newer than 1840? If it's there in 1865, probably was on the Underground Railroad. So you really have to look at the architecture, which I said this week when I heard that there was a log cabin found on Perman Run by McCracken's. And I said, I'll go see that. I took some pictures there on my phone. And I lived in a log cabin for a while when I was a kid. And I looked at that, and there's no mark on those logs except axes, you know, and it's very small, but the logs are huge, and it's like, I would like to count the rings in that log and see, you know, when was that log cut? And it doesn't quite look prehistoric, but it's a really old tree, and there's probably at least 2 or 3 trees that were nearby that were huge to make that log cabin. The guy who discovered it was under paneling, and they decided to save it. They're going to take it apart, measure it, and if it needs any help, do it, and then they're going to move it to a park, he said. I talked to one of them. I went there, and a car stopped, and he said, what are you looking at, son? And I had a conversation with him, and he said, well, this is what we're going to do with it. You know, and like, oh, you know, the guy, I work for the owner, and this is what we're going to do to save it, you know. And so I asked, when do you think that was built? That looks like the oldest building in Greensburg, Pennsylvania today. And I thought, on a stream that had a backyard that goes back down the hill to a stream, I wonder if it's got a trap door in there. I wonder if it, you know, a stone foundation with a small door, they put a slave in there, somebody shows up, they go out the back door, down over the hill in the stream, and get lost. It's possible. We have to do the search for it and say who was living there on the first map, who was living there, and was he a Quaker? You know, was he a Reformed Presbyterian? Presbyterian Church of Cumberland, things like that. So you have to be an investigator and a detective sometimes. You just got to ask questions to see if is this building there in 1840 and who lived there. All right, yep, there's a map. There's a huge underground railroad inside of Pittsburgh. They stashed people everywhere. A lot of African American churches were on the Underground Railroad in Pittsburgh. There was a new black newspaper. All those readers were on the Underground Railroad. There's the Monongahela Hotel, which Lincoln stayed in when he visited in 1860. It's on the Underground Railroad. Vashon's Baths, or Peck's Oyster House, or Merchant's Hotel. They were all, you know, they were all known as, well, we employ black people. They work in the kitchen. They change frequently, you know, that type of thing. And some of the help was going to stay in the hotel in the basement, and the help changes. So, Sharpsville out north of Washington, the Bruno Mansion, probably going back south, probably Roman's Castle. It's probably on the Underground Railroad. I'd like to go visit them and see what they're offering for that. But it seemed like the family itself were abolitionists, and they were in the right spot, which is on the Monongahela River, and they could visit the river anytime they wanted out their back door, and people had a big enough house that they had plenty of space to hide people. One more. Now, here's the books. The Underground Railroad, Presquitala, Places, and I've got a copy there. You can come up if you can and take pictures and get that one. The most moving book, if you want to read a book that just you can't put down, is Stolen. And it's set in Philadelphia. And they kidnap slaves. Is that my phone? We'll ignore that, sorry. And they will kidnap slaves in Philadelphia and send them back down the Chesapeake River. So if you're free in Philadelphia, it's dangerous. This one group specialized in young boys. All right? How would you like to work on a ship? They'll pay you some money, they'll give you some dimes. They put them on the ship, they hang on to them, the ship goes out, pulls into Maryland, get off, you're with this guy now. Now, the people that lured the boys onto the ship with money and food, they were all free African Americans. They were runaway slaves themselves. They did have jobs, and they treated other individuals as like, you're just money to me. Now this is a story, they found that whole situation, the abolitionists got a hold of this guy, put him on trial, so we have all these court records of these three guys who kidnapped, stole African-American children and sold them back into slavery. And he has 5 that they marched across Virginia and eastern Tennessee and through Tennessee's, and they were manacled the whole time. And only 3 made it to Mississippi to be sold. And your heart just breaks when you read that book, Stolen. Now, if anybody goes to C-SPAN online, the author's there to tell you the whole book. So if you want the story without working on the book, go ahead and look at Stolen and go to C-SPAN. And they interviewed him and he talked for an hour about how he found the material that was hidden in ports and places along the path. So there was reverse underground railroad sometimes where slaves were captured and taken back south. In south central Pennsylvania, they have the Christiana riots where the abolitionists were there and the slave hunters were there, and there was a gunfight over runaway slaves. We know they're in there, send them out type of attitude. And then they said, we're going to surround the house. Some shots go off, more shots go off. A couple of slave catchers are dead. One of the family's dead. And then the sheriff pulls off and says, you know, it's against the law to do all of this. And they, do you want to prosecute these guys for murder? Well, they want to do that. So these guys have to go to court. And what was your crime? Well, in Pennsylvania, it wasn't a crime. You know, these guys, well, they had a court order. Well, I don't know the judge who gave me a court order to come to my house and look at my house for these unruly slaves. So you've got stories of resistance by those people on the Underground Railroad. They just don't give up the slaves very easily. They'll find a way to hide them and move them on. So if someone knocks on their door, never saw him. I don't know. I heard some noises out here, but I never saw him. And they're like 12 miles away at somebody else's house. So do you have any questions at this point? No, I got one more. Who am I? That's me. I have Trinity High School class of 1970, Waynesburg College 74. I'm the director of Liberty Library, instructor in American history. I'm the director of the Paul R. Stewart Museum at the university. I've written 2 books about the Gettysburg campaign. So if you go to Gettysburg and rent a guide, you have to take a test. I took it twice. I got B's. I got like an 82 and an 86, and that's about as much as I wanted to know. And I wasn't going to move to Gettysburg so I could work as a tour guide. And so I took the questions in my head and looked up all the answers and then published them. There's another story that goes on with that, but I'm not going to tell you the type of test they gave us. It wasn't written by an educator. And I was like, these questions are, you know, whatever. So I wrote the questions and the answers to it. On the right-hand side, that's me in Gettysburg about 5 years ago. We had a bomb threat. All the waste management trucks were blocking the alleyway because the guy said he was in a car with a bomb. He would blow up the parade. That was taken by a newspaper reporter. It's raining. I'm walking down the street on the way to the parade, and all of a sudden this body flops in front of me and he's looking up at me. He's got a camera, and I ignore him. And then I look at the Sunday paper, it's like, I'm in the front. And that's from the Gettysburg newspaper. And I thought, well, okay, I'm done. I've done as much as I want with reenacting now, since we're the front page of the Gettysburg Times. And there's a couple, I'm part of a book, so I wrote a book, or a chapter in a book, about turning points in the American Civil War, and I looked at the election of 1864 and how close it was. And also, there's a book coming out called From Altars to Amputations. All of the churches in Gettysburg became hospitals. And that whole story is amazing. And the public school became a hospital. And who became the nurses? The girl next door. And they left their diaries that I got up, I didn't leave the house, I didn't go to the basement. The Union Army passed through, the Confederates came through, and I went to church. It was the Roman Catholic Church. And all the pews were moved, there's bodies and blood all over the place. And I said, oh, you're the nurse, you gotta help us here. And she went to a woman person, burst into tears, sat on the front steps of the church, cried all the way home. She lived 2 doors away. She went in and then she sat down and thought about it for half an hour and she said, I have to go back. I have to pull myself together and go back there. There's men dying, people walked away in my church. And she went back, she was there for 3 weeks. And she was a public school teacher too. So they had to replace the floor in the church because there was so much blood in it. And then she went to work in September and there was blood that went right through the floors. She was on the top floor and they said, kids, before we get started on our books, we're gonna have to clean this place up. And she gave the kids sponges and they scrubbed on all their desks that had blood on them, all the floors, trying to get blood out of the wood. And so the first week of school, the kids were cleaning the school building from all the, it was a Union hospital, and a Confederate hospital too. So that book should come out in November. And there's a few other things I'm going to do. Next week, I'll be in Greene at the public library talking about the environmental impacts of the Civil War on the North and the South, and the destruction in the South that occurred to all the farms and the factories. And Gettysburg was wrecked after the battle, and the removal of the dead. And how do you bury a 600-pound horse on the battlefield? And there's plenty of horses. There's 1,000 dead horses in Gettysburg. They're all artillery horses too. So, but they're not going to do that. Yes.
You mentioned a lot about the river.
Yeah.
If I was a bounty hunter, to be watching the river as opposed to chasing all the woods looking for someone, how do you know how the boats went north to Pittsburgh, like at night or?
Yeah. You talked to the dock workers at the last stop. So you had to be a detective and you had to get there and say, where's this boat going? It's going to Pittsburgh tomorrow morning. Okay, who works on that boat? All these guys at the bar. You go up to them. You have passengers on there. So it's detective work. You know, it's very rare that you're going to see someone accompany a black slave onto a boat. They're going to be in a box and they're going to load it. And there are individuals who get in boxes and they nail it down with the hammer and they ship themselves. They go to Baltimore, they're in the box, or this goes to New York City and they keep going. Oh yeah, thank you. Sure. So you've got a question?
Yeah, I really like the information about the Liberty Line.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, is there any connection between the Liberty Line and the fact that Route 19 becomes Liberty Avenue, Liberty Tunnel, and Liberty Bridge?
Very good.
I don't know how else they would get their name. I mean, if we have Fort Pitt there, and so was it named in 1776?
Yeah.
Maybe, or without a doubt, those were passageways. I mean, most of the slaves had to come over Mount Washington because I don't think they had tunnels over there. So, but Liberty Avenue is through the heart of the town, and it's always been hotels, and it's always been bars. It's been far enough away from the river. But one thing about Liberty Avenue, there was a canal that was built alongside the river, the Allegheny River, and the locks came through Pittsburgh, and where the Civic Arena was the pool. So, and then they reversed it. So if you got to where the Civic Arena was, you'd find a pool with boats with mules being pulled over a canal that's over top of the Allegheny River. And they found the original trusses when they built the big lawn center. And so there was a way, if you got onto a passenger boat, small, with a lot of cargo on it, you would go right up the Allegheny River. It was part of the Pennsylvania Canal System. So, yeah, so maybe, and then with the wicked eye, just like,
I have a question.
yeah, sure.
In the park here by the college, there's a monument. And
Uh-huh.
allegedly, I've heard stories that it was part of the Underground Railroad. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Soldiers Monument in the park, well, it was built after by the Grand Army and Republic folks, and it came up in about 1890. Now, what was there during before the Civil War? It was a pasture called the Commons, so people living in Waynesburg could have their milk cow and let it loose in the pasture, just like an old English village, or your sheep or your horse. So it was a common ground. Now, what's at the edge of that? Hannah Hall, built in 1850. And on the other side of that, where there's residence hall now, was a Presbyterian church. So if there's a barber on the corner of, let's say, High Street, and then if he wanted to hide people, he'd probably put them through the Commons, maybe in Hannah Hall in the basement, or in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church on the other side. So it's a possibility. I mean, if you look how it's laid out, say, well, if they're hiding here, then you're going to 2 minutes away, you'd be in the basement of, and the early founders of Waynesburg College were abolitionists. And then the church is not so far there, and I don't know who the pastor of the church was. But yeah, that's possible. We have to look it all up. Who was the pastor of that church in 1840? And there was a cemetery in part in that east end of the park. That was a cemetery. And they moved those graves when they put in the park.
Thank you.
Sure, of course, good questions. Yes,
There's a historic marker in Uniontown on Route 40 in town. It's called Baker Alley.
okay.
It's part of the Underground Railroad. Is there any literature on that? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I know it's there, and it seems likely because it's on the Mon River. And if Bowman's Castle, I call it, if it was a port on there, then they probably took them into town at some point. Because if they know you're on the river and you're an abolitionist, they will come knock on your door. So they come that way and then they go right out the back door to some place. Bounty hunters do a lot of it, don't know why.
There's no river in Uniontown.
Pardon?
There's no
Oh,
river.
right, I was thinking Brownsville, you're right, thank you. I'm from Washington County, what's over there, for necessity, all right? Yes,
In reference to the Baker's Alley, we have underground tunnels and we did
uh-huh,
under the sidewalks behind the street for the stores there and stuff. Anything, if any of you look about that, where they use those tunnels for the slave?
find the date of the tunnel. I'm sure they'd use tunnels, especially if they were hidden, or not, they weren't used very common. So if the tunnel started, it would be a narrow tunnel, in the 1840s, it's quite likely.
It went from like Baker's Alley all the way up to the Mount Vernon Inn.
Uh-huh,
And then from the Mount Vernon Inn to the Friary on Oakland Avenue. Then from the Oakland Avenue, went to Mount Macrina, where the pilgrimage is. Did they use anything in any of the books?
I haven't seen that mentioned, but you have to find out when that tunnel was done and what was the purpose of it.
Mhm.
I mean, no one's gonna build a tunnel just to be a tunnel on the Underground Railroad.
It was probably for some other,
You better have a good excuse for being there, or the slave hunters say it's the only tunnel in town, I think it's on the Underground Railroad.
yeah. Well, they're still there, some of them.
Okay. Yeah,
They
right.
tear buildings down, they end up,
Finding a tunnel underneath it, yeah. Well, well, Brownsville's got a historical site, you should start there,
Brownsville
Brownsville.
or Uniontown, it's in
Well,
Uniontown.
Well, Uniontown too, would probably have their historical society, it tells you how they were on the Underground Railroad, where they came from.
Okay.
Yes.
I have a book called The Underground Railroad,
Mhm.
and it's a quoting book.
Okay,
And there's about 20 different quote blocks in it. And it says, I don't know if it's true or if it could be true, it says that these quotes were hung on lines in different safe areas, a certain block meant that it was a safe area, or if it said to move on, that this was in a safe area, and they would hang them on the clothesline.
If
I don't know
that's
if
true,
it's true or it could be
then
true.
that's a sign to other people who live on that road.
Yes.
I mean, the slaves don't have a code book, like, what's that, you know, and they're traveling at night for the most part. So that might be a code between safe houses. It might be like, I know I'm here and this is what I do, and then if I see a quilt there for my neighbor that's 3 miles away, well, we've got the same ideas. Yeah, but the slaves couldn't choose that, and they were there at night. You know, yes,
The author, one of those, it's a children's book about the quilts.
yeah,
She just died, Faith Winkle.
oh, really? Thank you.
And according to Tom Maynard, he says that that's a myth. And then he
Okay.
takes a totally different approach to the underground world.
Yeah, that story is rather new. I mean, it's not in the literature of the area at all.
I questioned it, I thought it could be true, but not true.
Well, if it's true, it's only between neighbors watching each other's line,
Right.
you know, wondering. Because the African Americans had no clue about looking for that quilt when getting older.
So the other thing that, you know, your definition of what the railroad was and his definition, they're like extreme ends. Because he raided all of these places in Washington County
Yeah,
because, he felt as though people were claiming that this house or this church,
my
these tunnels
granddad,
were part of the Underground Railroad.
yeah,
When in fact, they weren't for various reasons. And he did a good job of,
He
in
did a
my
good
opinion,
job.
documenting.
mhm,
But your definition is interesting because, and I'm making up what I think your definition is.
sure.
Anybody who participated in helping fugitives were a part of the Underground Railroad.
If you owned the cart and horses that took it from place to place, you were on the underground, you were a conductor or something like that.
That's.
And, you know, it wasn't like you signed a postcard. It's like you got to knock at the door and say, could you do this for me? And you'd have to decide, like Harry Beecher Stowe, I've got a slave back here and we're trying to get ahead of the slave catchers. Would you help me? Well, I'm not an abolitionist, but tonight, neighbor, I'll do that for you. And that was my once. So, you know, you have to, you know, different people find their bravery at different times. And sometimes they don't talk about it. And if they do, it's maybe to a generation later. And it sounds like, well, maybe, maybe not. So people had to decide when confronted with that issue. They really did. And oftentimes the issue didn't come up except unexpectedly, like in the book, Harry Beecher Stowe's book. You know, dad comes home and mom says, "You're not an abolitionist." I go, "No." And would you take them back? Yeah, it's in the back home. And she said, "Well, here she is. Go ahead." And he's like, "I can't do that. Mom and the kid, I can't do that." She said, "Okay." And then he goes back to Washington D.C. and he starts thinking about things. And that's in the novel. Yeah. So it's often when you're confronting, right? When you're not expecting and you're confronted, and it's an issue. It's like you got to decide now. What would you choose at this point? So what else do we have?
Well, my ex-husband used to do a lot of carpentry work, and out there in Middletown,
Yeah.
some of those homes that are connected, he did work in their basement and found trapdoors and, you know, money and different things stuck into the walls. And, I don't know how far great back it goes in my
Sure.
family, but, my mom's side of the family come from Mississippi and was told to leave there. And I think that was more or less during the civil rights time that they had to leave there or else. And, they ended up in Brownsville.
Oh, yeah.
There's a, they talked about, there was so many blacks that lived in Brownsville and their families that came from down south. And my dad's people were from Virginia, but his great-great-grandmother, I think, was German, that brought them over from over in Europe.
there's a book that I used to make a requirement when I was teaching US survey, and I gave it to criminal justice majors. And it was a true crime in, I think, in New Orleans, where a family had they were from Germany, but it was close to Italy and they were dark. And the uncle, the brother died, and he inherited the young daughter with brown. And he told her that she was mulatto, and you're my servant. Until the relatives came home and said, what? And then there was a legal battle, and this little girl who grew up from about age 8 to about 18, 20. I'm not a slave. My uncle says I'm a slave. And they came by, and the evidence was that they saw this girl coming down the street, and they said, she looks just like her mom. That must be, Faith's child. Oh, no, that's not. My parents have been dead. And they said, no, you look so much, and she was Italian.
Yeah. Well, that happened to me. Me and my husband was going to New Orleans, and I know my family was from Mississippi. So I was like, we should kind of go through there or call somebody, look
Yeah,
at
sure.
so I don't know if we just went on the phone and found my last name was Brewer. And so we called this guy, and he goes, oh yeah, you should come through here on your way back, so we said, okay. And, my husband's like, you don't know who you're going to meet yet. He said, you're always out there just running, He said, you don't know who these people are. So we said, we'll meet at a McDonald's, okay? So we get to the McDonald's, so we got there before he did. And so we're just, standing outside the car and we're looking at people as they're going into the store, This guy comes around, the bin, and he comes straight at me, just like walking straight towards me. And my husband was like, well, wait a minute, hold up. He was about to jump him or something. And he goes, he just kept looking at me, and we were talking, and I told him, my grandpap's name and all that, And my husband said, why is he just like looking at you? He goes, you know what? My brother does our ancestry stuff, and you should he gave me his brother's number. And he says, you know what? We got this. And he called it a big house, which was really bad to say. But, if you guys ever want to come down, because we talked about fishing and everything,
Yeah, sure.
because we love the fish. And he was like, you guys come down there. We'll take you out on a boat and go fishing. You can stay with us and everything. And he says, gosh, I wish my mom was here, because I guess she must have been ill or something, and he was going to her home. He said, I wish my mom was with me, because she would just like love looking at you. And so once we, parted our ways, and I got home and I was telling my sons about it, and it's like, you're not going down there. You don't know who these people are. And that was when that 12 Years a Slave came out, You're not going down there and take you on a boat or whatever. But this gentleman just stared at me like he knew, like I looked like somebody, in their family.
Sometimes it's only a generation too, but it's like.
Yeah. But he was so nice and polite, and kept wanting to give me hugs and stuff. I was like, okay.
Well, 12 Years a Slave is a true story.
Yes.
How old of a gentleman was
Ooh, I'm 63, so this was about 5 years ago. He might have been 70.
he? Okay.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Might have been 70 at the time.
You think he was a long
Ray,
lost
we'll take
friend?
one more question.
Yeah, sure. You got a question? Yeah.
What was the name of the book that you just referenced?
Stolen?
No, about the 12 years,
Oh.
the uncle that put the little girl.
Oh, yeah, okay. I see the cover.
12 years.
The little orphan girl? Yeah, it's set in New Orleans, and it's a true story. Yeah. The little orphan girl, she was supposed to be she was an orphan, but all the neighbors, when they saw her when she was 12 years old, they, no, I knew your mom. And the uncle, like, you're my slave, right? So, yeah, I'm pretty sure, I think I got that book at home, and I know we have a copy in the library. And I gave it to students who were criminal justice majors to read and report on.
Is the library here or at the university?
At the university. Yeah.
Well, Ray, we'd like to thank you for
Sure.
this fascinating talk.
Thanks for all coming out on a very night. It's in far back.
So I do wanted to mention, we have some cookies and drinks in the back room here. And we will be having another talk later, I believe in May. We're gonna have somebody come in from SCI Greene to talk about a day in the life of a parole violator. So we're gonna have a little bit of exposure to what goes on there at SCI Greene. So we invite you all to come back. We're very grateful to you. And if any of you want to be on our email list about future presentations, I've got a sign-up sheet in this little room here.
Yeah, and on that list, if you want to copy my PowerPoint.
Did you ever go back?
Yeah.
No, but I still have, I still have the, phone number and address.
Look at this.